Good evening, everybody. I see people coming in there. You're all very welcome to this Irish Wildlife Trust webinar, and it's our last webinar of this latest season, which we started last autumn. We're going to give you all a break for the summer, but I hope you've enjoyed the webinars that we have held so far this year. And if you want to go back and look at the kind of things we've been talking about, please go on to the Irish Wildlife Trust YouTube channel, where you will find all of our past webinars. You can watch them back there. And there's a great variety of things there, from food security and rewilding to sharks and marine protected areas. And it's a wonderful resource that I hope you can enjoy. If this is your first webinar, you're very welcome. My name is Porrick. I'm the campaign officer with the Irish Wildlife Trust. I don't normally wear a shirt, but I was wearing a shirt today because we were at the National Biodiversity Conference, where there's a lot of talk about producing our next biodiversity action plan. So a lot going on, and certainly the profile of biodiversity is going up, if nothing else, and that is very welcome. So today we've got a very interesting speaker, and we've got a very interesting topic to talk about, and really we're taking a look at trees and forests and their role maybe in our climate and our biodiversity emergency, and how we can restore our forests. And we know that in Ireland, we used to have 80% of our country covered in native woodlands and forests, and that figure is down to, I mean, we're not even sure what the figure is, but it's probably no more than 1 or 2%. And much of what people think of forests are actually commercial monocultures of conifers that are really planted for one thing in mind, and that's for commercial production and very little else. But it's also an exciting time to be in the world of forestry, because things are changing. And in Ireland, our Minister for Land Use and Biodiversity, Pippa Hackett, has set up a project team called Project Woodland, and we're going to have a new forest strategy coming out in the coming months, and implementation of that is going to start in 2023. So certainly I'm hoping, and the Irish Wildlife Trust sits on Project Woodland along with a number of other NGOs. So I'm very much hoping that our new strategy that that is published this year will signal a radical departure in how we establish forests, because we have to do that urgently for biodiversity and for water and for climate as well. So there's many reasons. So to give us another perspective on this challenge, I'm delighted to welcome this evening James Rainey. And James is coming to us from Scotland, the Scottish Highlands, I think. James, is that right? You're well up north. And James is originally from Ireland, but he now works as an ecologist for an NGO in the Scottish Highlands. And he spent the last few years surveying and reporting on the health and resilience of Caledonian pine woods. So if you don't know what a Caledonian pine wood is, I'm sure James is about to tell us, and I'm sure he'll show us some of his wonderful photos as well. And he has extensive experience in assessing herbivore impacts in woodlands. So a herbivore is an animal that eats vegetation. So cows and deer and sheep are all herbivores. His main focus now is on ensuring that wild trees and wider ecosystem recovery are prioritized in rewilding and afforestation projects. So we're delighted to have you with us this evening, Jamie and James, and over to you in your own time. You can share your screen.
Thanks very much, Porrick. Hopefully folk can see that okay.
Yeah, all good.
Brilliant. Okay, so thanks very much for the introduction. Yeah, my name's James. I'm originally from County Derry. I moved over to Scotland about 4 years ago. And since then I've been working in the Scottish Highlands. I live up near Inverness, so pretty far north. Today I'm going to be talking about how we might go about rewooding Ireland and the different kind of models maybe for doing that. But it's going to be very much focusing on the things I've learned in Scotland, really, and some reflections on the process here of expanding tree cover. So to start off with, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the Scottish landscape, and then I'm going to talk a bit about what wild trees are and how they might contribute to woodland expansion in the future. I'm going to talk about peatland habitats a little bit, about other habitats as well, and then I'm going to kind of present a sort of model for a model for expanding woodland cover that prioritizes wild trees and wider ecosystem recovery. So just to start off with, this is a photo from Glenmore, which is in the Cairngorms in Scotland. We can see this is a lovely example of Caledonian pinewood. So in Scotland, we have these lovely big fluffy Scots pines, and there are 84 officially recognised wild populations of those pines across the Highlands. In Ireland, we thought they were extinct for ages as a wild species, reintroduced by the Victorians, but actually I think some research shows that there's potentially a wild population in the Burren at Rock Forest, so they might have just about clung on. But yeah, the pine woods in Scotland are very different than what there is at the Burren, and that's what I spent most of my time over here so far looking at. So the Scottish Highlands, the kind of classic way that the landscape's often portrayed is as this kind of majestic, mountainous, very open landscape. And you can actually see there are pockets of trees in this landscape down here and in this gorge and so on. But yeah, primarily kind of an open landscape. For a long time, people thought that was climatic or largely climatic in some areas. But as our knowledge has developed, we realize that this is actually very much an artifact of pressures on the landscape, which have caused woodland cover to decline. So actually, you know, if we take an aerial view of a landscape in the Highlands, this is a place in Lochaber. It looks very much like a kind of a desert. You know, there isn't really very much kind of woody vegetation here. We don't see lots of trees. There are little pockets here and there. And one of these pockets here, if we look at the old maps from 1870, we can see that there was a woodland in this glen called Camderry, which means the crooked thicket. So a really nice feature of a lot of the woodlands in Scotland, a lot of the really old woods, ancient woodlands, are that they have got Gaelic place names. So in Ireland, a lot of our woods, they've got anglicised place names. So for example, one of our big ancient woodlands, Cratlow Wood, which today is pretty much a conifer plantation, you know, that name has been anglicised probably from a Gaelic version. But yeah, on the old maps and today, these places still have Gaelic place names. The whole landscape's kind of named in that way. And it kind of gives us a glimpse into the connection that people actually had to these places, and that they actually meant something to the people who lived here. I'll talk a little bit about the history in a moment, but just very briefly, this is a cleared landscape. There used to be people who lived in a settlement down here and along here, various settlements in this glen. And at that time, actually, whenever there were more people there was more woodland. It was a lived-in landscape, and presumably there was a lot of shepherding of the livestock. The woodlands were valued, they were named. People probably got a lot of wood products from them. They probably also used them as shelter for their livestock. And then we had what are called the Highland clearances in the 17 to 1800s. And that's whenever people were cleared from the Scottish Highlands, they were removed from that landscape to make way for kind of large-scale sheep farming. So yeah, a sort of sad history in the Highlands. But if we take a look at how this landscape looked in 1870, there was quite a lot of woodland there. So all the green areas are woodland. And if we take a look at how it's changed, the red being areas of lost woodland, we can see a massive contraction of tree cover in this landscape, around 80 to 90% within 150 years in this particular part of Lochaber. And the woodland loss has been most extreme in inland areas where people were cleared from, and in areas that are now remote from settlement. That's where the worst losses of woodland have been. And as far as I can tell from the historical record, these woods weren't felled. They haven't been cut down in that interim period. They've just simply fallen apart as the grazing sheep have basically eaten all of the young trees for a few hundred years, and it means that, you know, you only get the old trees left, and once they die, they don't get replaced. So this seems to be completely lost because of that really kind of heavy grazing pressure for a very long time. So just to give a little bit of overview of some of the woodland history in Scotland, I guess we need to start about 22,000 years ago, whenever Scotland was covered in ice. And it's assumed at that time there were no trees, so it was the kind of height of the ice age, the last glacial maximum. And then about 15,000 years ago, it actually got warm, and some trees potentially returned from the south of Britain, and possibly from Ireland as well at that time. By 12,900 years ago, it got cold again, and so those trees had returned and then contracted into what we call micro-refugia. So these are little pockets which retain a suitable climate for woodland in a wider landscape that became unsuitable. 11,500 years ago, it got warm again, and trees spread out from these micro-refugia, and also from the southern refuges came back up. And by 6,000 years ago, we had maximum tree cover in the Scottish uplands at about 60% of the landscape. So it wasn't quite as high as it was in Ireland. As Park said, it was about 80% in Ireland, 60% in the Scottish uplands. And that 60% of woodland cover wasn't just trees, like it was an incredibly rich and varied ecosystem. There were lots of different kinds of woodland. You know, we had Caledonian pine woods and oak woods and ash woods and alder swamps, and everything in between. We also had high altitude birch woods grading into a kind of habitat called Montian scrub, where there's a lot of very specialist species that grow in that. So the wildwood was a very rich and varied ecosystem, and it was made up of wild trees. So the tree populations that recolonized Scotland after the Ice Age, we call those wild populations, and their descendants are basically, you know, still wild populations today. They've self-sown themselves since the last Ice Age in the Scottish landscape, and so we still do have wild tree populations in the Highlands. And we know that our wild trees, some of them are actually genetically unique, so their genetics represents the kind of pathways they took back into Scotland after the Ice Age. And so, for example, here we've got these Scots pines in Westeros. They're genetically distinct from some of the pines further east because they are thought to have taken a different pathway back after the Ice Age. And they also have a very high genetic diversity. So wild tree populations, they've got lots of genetic variation, and because of that, that gives them resilience to some of the problems that we face today. So things like climate change, where the conditions are changing for trees that are in the landscape at the moment. The more genetic variation there is, the more kind of raw material for evolution to work on, and the more adaptable those populations are. The other thing that it provides resilience to is disease. So, you know, if we think of ash dieback, where ash trees are starting to die now, or in some cases, well advanced dying off of ash, there will be some trees in the populations that are resilient to that just because they've got different genes that allow them to resist the infection. So having that high genetic diversity is really important, and wild trees have lots of genetic diversity. And this is partly reflected in their form. So we've got two islands here. The one on the left is an island covered in wild trees, and the one in the right is an island with native pine, just like over on this island, except these ones have been planted. And you can see that the structure of them is very different. You know, we've got kind of big bobbly trees over here and kind of tall straight trees over here. So quite different forms. And that's probably partly genetic, but also partly because this has developed over time through natural regeneration. And this was all planted at the same time. So they all kind of grew up together in that synchronous wave with quite even spacing. So wild trees tend to have very varied forms. If you think of some of the oak woods in Ireland, the kind of very twisty branches characteristic of those wild oaks, you know, you get very snaky trees and trees that don't look like the kind of regular shape that if you asked a child to draw a tree, they would draw the little kind of thing like that. Wild trees often don't really look very like that. And wild trees are generated through natural regeneration. They just seed themselves. You know, this is how trees have reproduced since trees evolved, I think about 300 million years ago. since then, they've been perfectly happy kind of seeding themselves over that time. And it's only very recently that tree planting's become a kind of important thing, I guess. So natural regeneration is a very powerful thing. It's what brought trees back to Scotland after the Ice Age, brought trees back to Ireland after the Ice Age. So yeah, it is potentially a really powerful force if the conditions are right for it. And here we can see these are all naturally regenerated young trees. You can see the older trees here in the background that they've come from. And yeah, there's a way of maybe extending, you know, sort of 100 to 200 meters away from the existing trees. And beyond that, there'll be little scattered individuals that over time they would produce their own seed and spread out more. I mentioned how in the Highlands and in the Scottish uplands, the maximum woodland cover was probably about 60%. And this is a picture of a naturally rewooded landscape in southwest Norway. And I think this is probably something like what Scotland would have looked like when it had its wildwood. You would see these open areas with deep peats and very wet bogs. Some open areas on the top of the mountains where we've got rocky outcrops and just very high altitude areas. Kind of random bits of openness that may in time develop into woodland here in the heaths. And yeah, there's just little patches here and there. It's not like a kind of closed canopy blanket forest. It's actually a very diverse landscape, and that's mostly down to the heterogeneous topology and the kind of rocks and stuff that's allowed peat to develop into deep areas and cause there to be wet areas and so on. You know, all of that adds to that kind of the kind of differences that are there in the landscape. And we can actually see this kind of landscape starting to form again in Scotland in places where we've got landscape scale restoration happening. These are all naturally regenerated young trees from, you can see kind of big pines scattered in amongst them. And you can see how they form these bands here. The wetter peatland areas have remained largely open with more scattered trees coming onto them in places. And yeah, so we can see that natural regeneration generates quite diverse landscapes, and it's not just a blanket of trees, it's a kind of varied effect that happens. So returning to our timeline, in Scotland, by the year 1000, burning, grazing, felling, and also possibly some of effects from climate change had caused tree cover to decline to about 20% of the landscape. And by the 1600s, that decline really intensifies. We start to see a lot of the woodlands being used for more industrial purposes, like industrial charcoal production, for example. And a lot of those woods were then being, so not only was the tree cover declining, but the woods that were left were being more intensively managed. In the 1700s, I mentioned that the highland clearances began then. And so people and cattle and the whole kind of cattle economy were replaced by sheep. And that's whenever we really started to see some tree planting taking place as well in the Highlands. And by the 1800s, you know, the clearances continued to about 1860. We had the start of something which, yeah, we're quite lucky not to really have as well developed in Ireland, sport shooting. So this is basically where you get large estates and they clients pay a lot of money to come and shoot a deer or grouse or whatever. So the management becomes very heavily focused towards having very high numbers of deer or high numbers of grouse. So that started in the 1800s, and tree cover declines from about 9 to 6% during this period. And actually, during the 1800s, planted trees now, for the first time ever in the Highlands, outnumbered wild trees. So people had taken over the process of creating new woodland at this stage. In the 1900s, sport shooting had become the dominant land use, and the deer population had become really, really large as a result. So people were encouraging high numbers of deer so that people could pay a lot of money to come and shoot them. And it was part of the kind of, it still is part of the aristocratic culture in the Highlands. We had the start of state forestry as well. So sometimes people conflate forestry and woodland, very different things kind of in our current paradigm. State forestry involved planting a lot of Pacific conifers, particularly cypress spruce, also lodgepole pine. And people were targeting that planting towards the areas that were seen as useless. So on boggy areas, they were often really damaged to put in all these commercial conifers. Also exist in ancient woodlands. Some of these last pockets of really rich habitat in the highlands were cut down and replanted with spruce, because they were seen as having no value. And so so a lot of ancient woodland and bog was converted into plantation at that time. And tree cover by the end of the 1900s had actually reached about 18%. So we're back up to near where we were in the year 1000. But that tree cover is very, very different to how it was back then. It's nothing like the wildwood. It's dominated by our Pacific conifers that have been planted for commercial forestry. And actually the wild tree populations, they're still declining now. This kind of increase in forest area is masking the fact that our surviving wild tree areas are still kind of falling apart. So in some places, wild trees have retreated into inaccessible refuges, like in this gorge here at Loch Nashella. And on the north side of this loch, actually, there was a really old map drawn in 1590 that showed that there were multiple pine woods along this side of the loch. And the area at that time was described as a mighty park of nature. Now the last kind of pine population in this landscape is restricted to this gorge, and it contains just a few handfuls of trees, really. So this whole kind of area has lost its tree cover over the last few hundred years. And of course, these areas, these refuges, are home to a lot more than just the trees themselves. They're also home to lots of woodland associated plants and tall herbs. They're home to lichens that grow on the trees. They're home to lots of specialist invertebrates, soil fungi, mosses and liverworts. A lot of the species that have retreated into these areas are actually, they find it quite difficult to disperse back into the wider landscape. So even if you plant trees, maybe a few hundred meters away, there's no guarantee that those species can actually move out, unless they're moving with that habitat expanding. Where woodlands are accessible in the highlands, so where they're not restricted to little gorges, they tend to look a bit like this. So it's not so bad kind of at lower altitudes and closer to habitation and roads and stuff, but far away from places that have become remote after the clearances basically are in like a horrific state. This is an ancient birch wood, an ancient population of wild trees, and they're all just kind of dying on their feet. This is a wood in that landscape where we saw tree cover decline by 80 to 90%. That's still ongoing basically. And this is down to grazing. We have the same issue in Ireland in places. So most ancient woodlands in Ireland are in the lowlands. So the lowlands are the areas where the kind of parts of the landscape where there's lots of little fields. And then the uplands are the higher up areas where field boundaries tend to be less pronounced or there's none at all. It's that kind of open mountain. Most of our upland woodlands in Ireland are found in Killarney and kind of Kerry in general, upland Kerry, and parts of West Cork as well. Very few upland woodlands survive in the likes of Mayo and Connemara and Donegal, which would be the other kind of really big upland areas. I suppose there's some as well in the Wicklow Mountains and little patches here and there elsewhere. But most of our upland woodlands are not in a great state at all. They're very overgrazed in a kind of similar way to how the woods in Scotland were open to sheep for a very long time. The same is true of the uplands in Ireland. They're, without the field boundaries to prevent sheep from accessing these areas, they've just grazed the woodland as intensively as they graze the grass around it. So you end up with this decline in woodland. And actually in parts of Ireland now, the main problem in places is deer, where the deer numbers have just got very, very high because there's no predators to help to regulate them. And this helps to show just the kind of impact that deer can have on woodland structure and the ability of woods to sustain themselves. Here we see an area of Caledonian pinewood with the photos taken along a deer fence. So this is outside the deer fence, where we've got no young trees. So each of these old trees that die are not being replaced, and the woodland's just fading away. Inside this deer fence, we've got young Scots pine and birch. These weren't planted, they just self-seeded. This is the kind of vegetation that the kind of high grazing intensity by deer is holding back. It's the ability of the woodland to regrow itself and expand. And actually, deer can affect more than just whether trees grow or not. They can also affect the kinds of trees that can grow in places. So deer are quite selective, as are sheep, in how they feed. And on this side of the fence, which is outside the fence, deer pressure went down a little bit, and that allowed all these young birch trees to grow up. Whereas inside the fence, we can see that young pine and birch have grown up together. So the deer pressure out here has managed to suppress any of the pine regeneration. They fed selectively on the pine, leaving the birch. So deer can have a big influence on the diversity of trees that are able to grow, and also on the ground vegetation. So outside this fence, it's all kind of grassy, and this woodland's just falling apart. Inside, we've got lots of lovely blaeberry, hardfern, cowberry. A lot of these plants are insect pollinated, and they produce fruits in the autumn time. So they're very ecologically productive. There's lots of things that they in turn support, whereas the grasses really don't support that much. So yeah, it's not just about the trees, it's also all of this kind of flowery vegetation, berry producing vegetation as well. And whenever you reduce herbivore impacts at landscape scale, you can see things like this. So this is an area called Glenfeshie, where the deer pressure has been taken right down to a very low level. And you can see all these young trees that have just expanded out from these older populations that are helping to join them all up. We've got a diversity of trees coming through. Scots pine, birch, there'll be rowan in here as well, willow, some alder. So yeah, whenever you remove that pressure, in places where woodland wants to be, woodland will grow. I talked a bit about how a lot of woods in Scotland were converted into conifer plantations in the 20th century. The same has happened in Ireland, and in fact, in Ireland, it might actually be worse in terms of the amount of ancient woodland that is under conifer plantation at the moment. We call these areas plantation on ancient woodland sites, or in Ireland, plantation on old woodland sites. And you can see that often there are surviving wild trees in amongst these planted conifers. The planted conifers cast a lot of shade, and so they kill a lot of the stuff that's on the ground, the wildflowers, and over time they start to kill any of the surviving trees that are there. So this is a big old oak. It's still alive, actually, just about, and it urgently needs these trees removed from around it to be able to regrow. And yeah, sadly, in Ireland, about 50% of our ancient woodlands, this is the ancient and long established woodland inventory in Ireland, showing the proportion of sites on that inventory that are under conifer plantation, mixed conifer and broadleaf, recent clear fell, and non-native broadleaf. So actually over half of the woodlands on our ancient and long established woodland inventory are some form of plantation on ancient woodland site, or very damaged by that. So in terms of focusing efforts in Ireland to kind of put right some of the things that have happened in the past and to restore woodland, this is a massive place to start. And this is a site in Northern Ireland. I think it's called the Brantry in Armagh. And yeah, here we can see where the non-native conifers have been felled in this plantation on an ancient woodland site, and loads of the stuff from the ancient woodland have just grown back up again. You can see there's hazel in here, there's rowan, there's birch. There's some old oaks in amongst this as well, which are now re-sprouting and being able to grow again. So yeah, it's very possible to restore these kinds of sites. You just have to remove the non-native conifers basically, and not replant afterwards. I'm going to move on now to talk a bit about the model that's been followed really to mostly increase tree cover in Scotland. The model has focused primarily on tree planting, and it's been focused on, for a long time, it was focused on planting non-native species for commercial forests. Now there's quite a lot of planting of native species as well. And this is an example where it's been really well done. This is at Carafron, which is in the Scottish borders. which is a very heavily deforested area. There aren't many populations of wild trees really surviving to provide that seed source to spread back out. And so here there was landscape scale planting undertaken, done in a very sensitive way. And you can see, you can see how this glen is kind of coming back to life again after being very kind of, treeless for quite a long time. But this unfortunately isn't the norm. And a lot of planting in Scotland is really nonsensical. Here we can see the mounds here are often whenever trees are planted in Scotland, people come along either with machines or by hand, and they'll create these little mounds on the ground and plant the trees into them. The trees in the mound here have died. You can see there's a dead Scots pine here. It's kind of gone orange because of a drought. The same over here, one's died. There's natural regeneration of pine coming up all around it, pine and birch. So like some of the planting is just really pointless in the first place. It's done close to where there is a seed source of trees. And whenever you have to put up a fence to protect your planted trees, it lets the natural regeneration come up as well. And often the natural regeneration can be stronger kind of than the planted trees. However, in some cases, the planted trees, because they're fertilized, if they don't suffer from drought, they can have more resources there and they can then grow faster and establish better than the natural regeneration. So sometimes planting is very pointless. Other times it's actually damaging. So here we can see planting in peat. There's way too much of this happening in Scotland, where this peatland area has been mounded and lots of trees planted into it. Now, these are native trees, but this is not going to create a kind of natural woodland. It's not at all how trees would have grown on peat like this. And it gets worse in places. Here we've got an area of peatland that's been drained to plant trees into this deep peat. Plant native trees into deep peat. It's really nonsensical sometimes and very destructive. And it helps to create this kind of conflict between trees and peatland. So actually, in reality, the forces that are damaging populations of wild trees and peatland are often one and the same. In this landscape, it's very, very high deer numbers, which have prevented these old wild Scots pines from regenerating. And they've also caused this blanket bog area to start to erode and degrade away. So all this peatland, which is locking up huge amounts of carbon, is just washing away. And our wild tree populations are dying. And it's the high deer numbers that are the cause of both of these things. If you reduce the deer numbers down, in some areas of peatland, what you'll get is bog woodland forming. So in some areas, trees will come on to bog, but they're often very slow growing, twisted and gnarly, and they're not actually damaging the body of the peat. They're not causing it to dry out as long as it hasn't already been drained. And so bog woodland's a very, very rare habitat type, home to some very special things. We should really be wanting more of it. But yeah, in other areas, the peatland just remains open. Trees don't come onto it at all. And so I think part of the conflict that is perceived between trees and peat, it kind of comes down to planting and forcing trees to grow in an area where they either wouldn't naturally grow or where they would grow at kind of a much lower density than they would because of planting. Something that we have a lot of in Ireland still in places is really, really nice species-rich grassland. So some of these pastures, which are used mostly by cattle, sometimes by horses, the really flowery ones, are often found in the marginal uplands. So you've got your lowland areas with lots of little fields, very green fields, and then your upland areas, which are don't have many boundaries. On the margins between the two, there are places, particularly in Fermanagh and Leitrim, other parts of the country as well, where you get a lot of these kinds of grasslands, and they're home to their own specialist species. Some of them are very ancient as well, maybe thousands of years old. And that includes things like Irish Leafy Tresses orchid, marsh fritillary butterfly, Narrow border bee hawk moth. These areas as well could very easily and are being damaged by tree planting, and in some cases just by removing the kind of cattle and stuff that graze them, which allows all the scrub to come on. In time, this would create quite nice woodland. However, there's a lot of value in these really old grasslands, and so it's important to actually protect these and to have some areas really which are not a priority for expanding trees onto. this is one of the last places I'd be thinking to target for tree planting or for woodland expansion. It has so much value in its own right, and a lot of the things that are there can't survive in woodland. Moving on then from some of the conflicts between habitats and tree planting, we also have issues with the kind of fencing model that is often employed within tree planting projects, and also sometimes within natural regeneration projects. So if you were to look at this picture and guess which bit was inside the fence, you might say it's this bit, because outside the fence would be where all the trampling is by the deer that are following along. Actually, this is inside the fence. Deer have got inside it, and they're, deer fences basically aren't very effective for very long often. They'll maybe last for like 5 or so years, and then deer will get in somehow. And then once deer are inside the fence, if nobody takes them back out again, they just start to eat a lot of the trees that are there. So we've got issues kind of with the fencing model, because in places it's not effective. Fences are only designed to be temporary anyway, so even where it has been effective in getting these trees up, this is just one generation of trees, and then you're back to a stage where this tree population can no longer function. It can no longer reproduce itself. You know, if a fire were to come through here and burn them down, they couldn't regrow because the deer pressure is so high again. And a lot of the ancient woodland species, that the kind of wildflowers and stuff, they can't survive that grazing pressure, so you lose all of that once your fence comes down. And another big issue with fences is that they often go where they're not really needed the most. So this is a picture looking from the air at an area of ancient woodland in the Highlands. And beside it here, you can just about make out this kind of rougher, these dots here. This is now a massive plantation, and the fence doesn't take in any of these wild trees. So the wild trees are ignored, allowed to continue to decline, while the fence goes around your area of planted trees, which is really nonsensical from an ecological point of view, especially when you're planting native trees. And I'll just zoom in to show, you know, you can see here the wild trees, and there's the fence. You can see it from the aerials. The fence is defending all of the planted stuff, and the wild stuff is just kind of left to fall apart, which is a massive shame. So there's a kind of lack of whenever people approach things using fences, they often put them in places that are going to support newly planted trees in open areas, and they ignore the wild trees that are already there and are already declining. So there's a kind of lack of ecologically strategic thinking. This is an aerial from part of Ireland, so in the lowlands, where most of the Scottish Highlands is unenclosed. It's these kinds of very open landscapes. Whereas here we've got lots of little fields, but you can see where the old woodlands are. You know, they're following the rivers in this landscape. So if you were to choose to plant trees in an area and defend them, in this case, it wouldn't be by excluding deer, it would be just not putting livestock into certain fields. You know, if you wanted to plant up an area and you were choosing to do it in these fields here, that's really not going to benefit any of the trees that are here. It's not letting them expand out, and it's not letting them take all of that diversity around them with them as they expand. So if we focused more on where our actual old areas of woodland are and allowed expansion to take place from there, we would get kind of much better ecological outcomes, more ancient woodland species able to colonize recent woodland, and make a really nice habitat as well in the process. So after just chatting about some of the issues with the kind of model that's being followed in Scotland, I should say that that's not the case everywhere. In some places, this area is a large fence that's allowing natural regeneration to spread out and increase woodland area that way. In other places, deer are just being reduced in the landscape to allow whole landscapes to start to rewood again. And this is like a much more preferable option than just planting up these little parcels. Like the idea that we're going to really increase our forest cover in a really meaningful way with these little kind of chunks at a time, and also putting them in places where it's not really beneficial to most of the stuff that's there, I think it's a really bad model. And we'd be much better to focus on our wild tree populations, prioritize them anyway, and expand out from them. And then where they're not present, then there's a much greater case for planting in a very sensitive way that doesn't involve all this this ground preparation and fertilizing and so on, which are really techniques from commercial forestry that are not really appropriate for planting native species. So if we bring together a lot of the things that we've kind of covered here, this is something that I've been working on, which is a framework for prioritizing wild trees and wider ecosystem restoration. So some of the things I've just been talking about there, some of the issues, it's trying to make us kind of look at landscapes in a way that we prioritize the right areas and we kind of get the best ecological result through expanding tree cover rather than just kind of automatically go into planting. So there's kind of 10 stages in this. And the first stage is about identifying where your refuge areas are. So instead of just going in there with a mindset of let's plant up some area, we want to increase tree cover by X amount, you're actually looking at, well, where are the wild trees in this landscape? And can we allow them to expand out naturally? So we're identifying the wild tree refuges. We're also looking at peatland, so identifying where areas of peatland are and other important habitats as well, all in tandem. So we're trying to kind of bring all this stuff together rather than just kind of focusing on we must increase tree cover. We're thinking more about ecosystems as a whole. And then what we would do is go out and we would survey these areas and find out, what are the threats? What's the condition of the woodland at the moment, the peatland at the moment, and how can we kind of fix that? And then we would analyze the data that we get and use that to prioritize areas in the landscape. So if we're following things using a fencing model, or we've got little fields or something like that, we can then prioritize areas for woodland restoration expansion, in strategic places. Once we've kind of looked at everything that's there and identified all of that. And then kind of really only at stage 4 would you design a project to expand woodland or restore a landscape. You would design that after you've gathered all the relevant information. There's way too much, I think, at the moment of people thinking, oh, I want this area to be trees. And that's the extent of the kind of strategic thinking that's going on. And the policy is designed in that way as well. The policy is just geared towards, we want you to plant trees wherever you want to plant trees. No matter how kind of how ecologically positive that actually is. So if we take all this information into account first, if we know where our wild tree refuges are, if we know where our priority peatland areas are, we can design projects so that it will meaningfully restore the kind of most important areas and expand woodland out strategically in key places where there aren't conflicts with other habitat types or there aren't conflicts with peatland, for example. And then if you do want to go and do a tree planting project because there aren't many wild trees or they're not going to spread out very far, or sorry, they're not going to spread out far enough in the kind of time frame you're thinking of, at that stage, that's whenever you would look at doing your tree planting. So it would be your kind of secondary consideration rather than at the moment where tree planting is driving a lot of these decisions about increasing forest cover. Or rather the policies around it are, you would actually instead be, you'd be using tree planting as a kind of secondary consideration rather than the driver. Your primary consideration becomes the wild trees and your other ecosystems. Your secondary consideration is planting. And then you basically go and make sure that there are no problems with where you wanted to plant. And you would design your planting scheme in the best possible way so that you're not going to create all these kind of conflicts and you're going to create woodland that looks a bit like natural woodland in the end. And then once you've done all that, you can actually implement your project. You put up your fence somewhere and you monitor within it to make sure that no deer get in or no sheep get in or whatever it happens to be. And you monitor that situation and react whenever you have to, basically. So this is the kind of, this is a framework for doing some of this stuff. At the moment, policy is a big barrier to it. But at least whenever we've kind of got to the stage where we, if we kind of buy into the idea that we want to expand out our refuge areas and prioritize them, then, it's a really good start to be able to advocate for a better model of woodland expansion. So I think that's me. I've kind of there's a lot of information in there. I really appreciate that. So yeah, very, very happy to take lots of questions. And if anyone wants to get in touch with me separately, please feel free to do so. My email address is just down here in the corner. And yeah, that's me. We want to have a lot more areas of woodland that look like this in the future, rather than areas that we're planting that we think are going to look like this, but they may never do. So I'll finish there and take some questions. Thanks.
Thanks so much, James. That's really fascinating stuff. People at home, if you have a question for James, please put it into the Q&A button rather than the chat. So I only have one list to monitor. James, I have a couple of questions for you. For your last point there about policy, because as you know, we're changing our policy at the moment, and we like to look at what other countries are doing, but we don't like to look very far. So we typically look at Scotland or England or Wales, and we don't like reading things in funny languages. So we're very limited really in the scope that we look. But does Scotland have you kind of answered the question already that it doesn't have policies. You said policy was a barrier, but I mean, what are Scottish policies like at the moment for expanding native woodlands?
So at the moment, the policies are changing a bit, and it's becoming I think a bit more friendly again to natural regeneration and natural expansion, and particularly kind of actually targeting deer management, which is the main issue in the Highlands. So deer in the Highlands have got to these really high levels because we don't have the predators, and we're also, most estates are feeding deer in the winter as well to keep their numbers high. So yeah, actually reducing deer, and that's done primarily through culling, which happens across the Highlands anyway, just not at high enough level to actually kind of have a big impact. Targeting policies more towards that is where things need to go. So in the Highlands, the problem is essentially, it's poor deer management, and a side effect of that is that woodland isn't expanding out and that we're not kind of increasing our tree cover. The policies at the moment are very focused on, well, not just there's a few things. There's a woodland carbon code, which is now starting to drive a lot of decisions about tree planting. The woodland carbon code is a code which basically allows you to go and plant trees and then claim a certain number of carbon credits for doing that, and then you can sell those carbon credits often to a big corporate somewhere who wants to be able to offset some of the carbon that they're emitting, which is a dubious enough thing anyway. But the woodland carbon code is geared towards predictability, regularity. You want to know that you're going to have so many stems per hectare to generate this kind of predictable woodland that can, slip into the carbon code. Becomes a bit more tricky with some of the natural regeneration stuff, because natural regeneration is a process. It's ongoing. It's not just this one-off thing. It's easier under the carbon code to go for this kind of one-off, okay, we just fence long enough until we get those trees away, until they're tall enough to resist the deer by themselves, and then that's it. That's the objective really. And that's the way people still very much think about it. So there's the woodland carbon code, and there's the kind of the grants and stuff for woodland creation, and most of those go towards tree planting. So I think that if the policies develop more along the kind of deer management side, as a side effect of that, we will get all this woodland spreading out on its own. But yeah, looking at part of the problem is that we look at woodland creation in this little, it's a compartmentalized way in the landscape. Like this little bit will be woodland, and it's not kind of landscape scale at the moment. So
yeah, and maybe a second half to that question, because I did go to visit Glenfeshie a few years ago, and it's very impressive. But in contrast with Ireland, it doesn't seem like that part of Scotland has many farmers. Whereas in
Yeah.
Ireland, we don't have the big estates. We have lots and lots of landowners and commonages, and it's all very complicated sometimes. So what has the public reaction been, or the local reaction been, to tree expansion and heavy culling and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so very controversial at the time at Glenfeshie. I think it's now a bit more accepted. The debate is moving more towards what's kind of termed the green lairds. So people who are buying these big estates with the intention of basically getting lots of carbon offsets from them and doing lots of tree planting often. So yeah, there's big issues in Scotland around land ownership and equitable kind of benefiting in an equitable way with this kind of rush that's going on here at the minute for carbon credits, and tree planting is a big part of that. So yeah, so local, there's not kind of a set kind of single homogenous sort of local perception of these things. Different people think different things. People from traditional estate backgrounds, so sometimes they're very resistant to some of the changes. And then you have other people who are more interested in kind of community benefit and making sure that, people equitably benefit from the changes that are happening. And they're interested in making sure that that's done in the right way. So there's a range, I'd say, of views on things. In terms of, the kind of, with respect to farming and stuff, there's actually quite a lot of work going on with smallholders in Scotland, particularly crofters, which is a kind of unique, not a unique, but a model of farming in Scotland where someone has like a little, often a small hold in which they kind of look after for a while, and they're doing tree planting often, or expanding woodland and stuff. So it's kind of not as polarized as you might think with farming in the Highlands anyway. There isn't an awful lot of farming in some of these kind of peaty areas, and where you've got kind of big open landscapes. So the main issue is around kind of deer and deer management. Yeah. In Ireland, I'd imagine like the ideal thing that would happen is just that things would be targeted in a more strategic way, that the benefits of naturally expanding woodland will be recognized, and that there would be more kind of there'd be more reward for doing that. If you rewarded people for if you identified, basically following that kind of wild trees framework, if you identified what the key refuge areas were in the landscape, and you created a kind of natural expansion zone around them and said, okay, anyone who wants to do woodland expansion within this area is going to get twice the grant rate or whatever. I mean, that's a simple way to incentivize that kind of stuff. But whenever you've got more divided land ownership, there needs to be a lot more kind of working together and a lot more engagement with people to kind of get towards where you want to go with stuff. Yeah.
There's a lot of work involved in getting to that, because I mean, we know where some of our ancient woodlands are, but we don't by any means know where all of them are, or we don't have that targeted payment structure that would be needed. Now, James, you talked a lot about trees, but Anthony is asking here, what are the prospects for predator reintroduction in Scotland, given that the predator is mightier than the fence? Do you want to talk about that? I mean, there was a lynx project that seemed to be getting somewhere, wasn't there?
So there has been, people have been looking at lynx and doing a lot of community consultation with that. And I think the kind of consensus that came out of that is that there's scope to reintroduce lynx. Right now is not quite the right time. There needs to be a bit more debate about it. But I mean, personally, I think that'll come because it's a very, it seems to me like a logical thing to do. We have, there are conflicts with lynx, but they're not, I don't think that they're all manageable from my understanding. So lynx will predate sheep, but primarily sheep that visit woodland. So sheep that are grazed in woodland would be at risk of lynx predation. People should really be trying to exclude sheep from those woodlands anyway. and there are ways that this is managed in other countries. So I think that lynx is a realistic prospect to be taken forward at some time soon, maybe in the future. And the way I would see it is that there isn't really talk about wolves and bear in the Highlands at the moment. I guess a lot of that will hinge on how things go with lynx if that happens, because the kind of natural if we couldn't kind of deal with lynx, then we definitely couldn't deal with wolves. So I feel like there's maybe going to be some movement on that in the near future, but even reintroducing lynx primarily predate roe deer, which is just one of the 4 deer that are found in Scotland. Red deer are the main kind of issue, which wolves are the main predator of them. So, even once you introduce a predator, there's kind of a long lead-in process then of that predator actually reaching a kind of population size where it will have the impact that we might expect it to have on roe deer populations. And then beyond that, we actually will need wolves kind of at some point in the future if we didn't want to manage deer or red deer rather. So I think predator reintroductions in themselves, my personal view is that they're a good idea, as long as everyone can kind of be brought along in that process, or most people brought along in it, and the support system set up to deal with the conflicts. But it's also not going to solve the deer problem immediately in Scotland, because these areas of woodland are in a kind of critical state right now. Peatlands are eroding right now because of trampling. Like, we need to kind of we need to be responsible for that, and we need to reduce deer to levels where they're compatible with recovery of woodland and peatland.
I know what you're saying, and we had a webinar here, must be over a year ago, and we talked to people in Spain, and even though they have quite a lot of wolves in Spain, it wasn't having any noticeable effect on the herbivore population. And the belief was that even though there were, I think there's over 2,500 wolves in Spain, that even that number was too low to have any impact. So we shouldn't oversell the potential impact of predators. We probably need an awful lot of them, and particularly in Scotland, you see enormous numbers of deer, don't you? You'd need an awful lot of wolves there. There's a question here now. It's a very long question, and I'm not sure. It's from Kieran, and he's asking. He says, "I assume blanket bog on hillside and upland areas is generally due to historic deforestation and persistent overgrazing." And I mean, this is the issue of peat and trees is complicated, and what you've been showing in your photographs really are trees on peat, right? I mean, the uplands in Scotland are peatlands, right? They might be shallow peat or whatever. I mean, is it a case even that that because of deforestation you get bogs or can you maybe elaborate a little bit more on the interplay between trees and peat? Or if we want to decide we want to have trees on peat, how should we go about doing that, particularly say if there are no trees in the area?
So woodlands on blanket bog are actually very rare in the Highlands. There's very few of them. And pardon me. So blanket bogs are areas with peat depth more than 50 centimeters deep that are kind of across the landscape rather than in the kind of depression like a raised bog would be. Woodland is expanding out in places onto shallower peats. In some places expanding out onto blanket bog. As trees kind of come onto peatland, my understanding is that the soils change and become more kind of, the leaf litter starts to build up in them and so on. And the ancient woodlands are not on peatland generally, like it's on kind of, humus that's built up and so on. It might be a bit peaty, but I don't know if you would call it peat because it's got a lot more stuff in it. I kind of have this issue of kind of creating, even if blanket bogs are created by historic deforestation, which in some places it looks like they were, in other places blanket bogs are perfectly natural, and the pollen record shows that in some places there have not been trees there since, or certainly not kind of big trees there since the ice retreated, and that's not down to human management. So some blanket bogs are completely natural. Others may have expanded or spread or been caused to initiate as a result of historic deforestation. The issue I have with this is that this is a kind of very field-based view rather than from a field worker rather than someone who's a paleoecologist. But if you have lots of grazing on peatland, peat doesn't really build up very easily because the sphagnum gets trampled. And if you see the blanket bogs in Scotland, like they're atrocious, like because of the deer trampling, it causes the sphagnum to break up. It causes the underlying peat to start to erode, and compaction of the peat as well. So like to get healthy bog, you actually have to have reasonably low livestock or deer numbers. So it doesn't really make sense to me that this, and also so if you don't have much of the sphagnum, then you're presuming that your peat's going to be generated by the kind of millennia or by some of the grasses or whatever that are leaving stuff down. But if they're being grazed enough, then they're not going to leave much of a leaf litter, so you wouldn't really get a build-up of peat. So surely peat build-up is related to relatively low herbivore impacts, because if you've got higher levels of impact, then it just doesn't really form peat very well.
Yeah.
That's just, I guess, an observation from the hill. But yeah, I mean, the paleo record does suggest that some areas of bog expanded as a result of clearance of woodland, and it may be that it wasn't very heavy grazing all the time, it was periodic burning instead, that kind of kept trees off or whatever. So who knows what was going on there. But the idea that we can kind of turn back that clock, like you've got 2 meters deep of peat in places and or more, and even if eventually you might get some kind of semblance of woodland growing on that, like all of the trees will be very slow growing because they're in deep peat, there's not much nutrient there. And yeah, the idea of kind of reversing the process, I doubt it, basically.
Yeah.
I think we should look after the peatlands that we have, and I think we should, if trees are naturally expanding out onto an intact peatland, there's no problem there. If trees are expanding onto a very damaged peatland, one that's been drained, one that's been cut over, in that case, trees can definitely cause problems. Like if you see some of the very dense birch regeneration coming onto some of the raised bogs that have been damaged, like that's not a natural thing. The bog wouldn't naturally support that kind of birch.
So restore the hydrology. I know we've just gone past 8 o'clock, but there was just, maybe you can answer this question briefly. It was about rhododendron, another invasive species. Have you got those in Scotland? Are they a big problem?
Yeah, we do. There's big issues with rhododendron. Again, it's kind of related to the deer issue, because rhododendron spreads best whenever you haven't got much of a field layer. Rhododendron has very tiny seeds and not much of a reserve there. So it struggles to compete if there's any kind of significant heather or blaeberry. But whenever that's all grazed away and you've just got kind of mosses and stuff, it's the perfect seed bed for rhododendron. And it's very unpalatable to deer as well. So while they'll eat all the competing species like the heather and blaeberry and the birch even and pine and rowan and so on, they'll not eat the rhododendron, or if they do, they're pretty desperate. So rhododendron is an issue, and it is related to the deer issue.
So less of a problem when you have healthy natural regeneration and
which was surprising to me. I whenever I was originally writing up stuff about the Caledonian pinewoods, I was in my head the way to do the management would be remove the non-native species first and then reduce the deer, so you don't get this pulse of non-native regeneration. But with respect to rhododendron, it actually, you need to reduce the deer down to really kind of help to get rid of it, to allow that stuff to regrow. And yeah, in pine woods which have healthy heather cover and stuff, there can be patches of rhododendron, like in the surrounding area, and they're not kind of making any headway into the pine woods. So it creates a lot of resistance within the woodland.
That's really very interesting. Yes, James, there's loads of questions there, and we could spend another hour. Maybe there's a lot of interest in what you're talking about. Someone did ask if you could put your email address into the chat. If you feel like doing that, please do, and I will round up for this evening. So look, I think that was a really fascinating talk, and very, very relevant to a lot of the challenges that we face here in Ireland. So James has just put his email in the chat there, if you want to scribble that down. If you don't get a chance, you can email me afterwards, I'll pass it on. And so thanks very much for listening, and thank you, James. It's been fascinating, and it's wonderful to see the kind of compare and contrast between Scotland and Ireland, because they are similar in so many ways. And yeah, so I think that's really just the last from us for this season. If you enjoyed this webinar or our other webinars, please do consider joining the Irish Wildlife Trust. We're a national non-governmental organisation. We try to keep these events free and accessible as much as possible, but we do rely on donations and memberships to support the work that we do. So please do join and support us if you can. Go to iwt.ie. And please enjoy your summer. And we already have our first webinar of the autumn lined up, but I'm not going to give away the secret. I'm going to let you be on tenterhooks now for the next 2 months, wondering what we're going to be talking about in September. But please do tune back in at the time, and we look forward to talking about more wonderful wildlife and environmental topics later in 2022. So thanks again to James, and thanks everybody at home. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.